Hi there, it's Lisa Thomas again with Remax Complete Realty. Today we'll be continuing our series on agency and representation forms. I hope you enjoyed the overview that we did on the Consumer Relationship Guide. The next form in our series is the Exclusive Buyers Representation Agreement. Okay, so when completing the executive or exclusive buyers representation agreement with our buyers, the first thing that we're going to fill out is an agreement number. Everybody does this a little bit differently. What I usually put up here is just the buyer's name, or last name, and then maybe a number after. So the name and then 100. You'll see here that it says that this is to be used for designated agency brokerages. And as we explained earlier, Remax Complete Realty is a designated agent brokerage. So this is the correct form that you'd want to use, not common law. The next thing to fill out, of course, is going to be who is the brokerage, and that's Remax Complete Realty. And then over here is the buyer's names. There's 2 lines again because sometimes there's a husband and wife, sometimes there's only one. The next section is just about the property that we're going to be helping the buyers look for. So there's a property type. You could put something like residential single family or a condominium or whatever type of home that they're looking for. The second portion to fill out is the market area. And so in Calgary, a lot of the times we'll just put it's in Calgary and area because we might find that people are going in between Calgary and Okotoks or Airdrie or Cochrane. So by putting Calgary and area, it outlines all of those areas for you. Point number 2 is talking about the agency relationship. And so this is where Remax Complete gives us as agents the exclusive right to assist our buyer. So your name would go here where I've listed agent name. And then it explains as well, of course, that as a designated agent, we are going to be dealing with our client solely as the agent. It's a sole agency relationship. And point number 2.2 is just outlining like what would happen if the agent no longer belonged to Remax Complete Realty. In that situation, the Remax Complete may assign another agent to work on the client's behalf, or the client may decide that they are going to choose somebody different. Point number 2.3, 2.4 is where we will put when does this agreement to work together start. So it's usually the day that we're explaining this form and the day that they're going to sign. And then also we have to indicate when will this agreement end. Everyone's different in what they put for a date here. For myself, I usually put 6 months. I find that at most, when you're dealing with a client, it's going to take about 3 months to find them the property that they want to put an offer in on. And then you may have a possession period of up to 90 days. So by putting 6 months, it kind of gives you a large enough window to complete the transaction. If for whatever reason, maybe there's somebody that takes longer to find the property, they're looking for something very rare, you may need to amend this at some point to extend the dates. So We just need to make sure that these dates are covered in the timeline that we're working with our client. Point number 3 talks about what the brokerage's responsibility is. And so for the most part, the brokerage is responsible to oversee what it is that their agents are doing. They have to support and supervise the designated agent. They're also responsible for holding any money that may be put in trust. And they're also responsible to give a copy of the agreement to the buyer as soon as possible after signing. Point number 4 covers what the designated agent's responsibilities are. And for the most part, what our responsibilities are is covered in the Consumer Relationship Guide. So when it gets to this point, I always remind them, remember when we talked about this form and what my role is and my responsibilities, that is covered in point number 4. The next point, point number 5, just talks about the services that we're going to provide. And so you're going to list here all of the services that you typically will provide your buyer. Everyone really will put something different in here. It depends on your business model and the services that you provide. So to give you some examples of what you could put there is, I say I will set up an auto search for my clients. I will arrange showings. I will assist with writing the offer to purchase. I will assist with negotiating the offer to purchase. I will provide professional referrals. All of the things that you typically would provide as a service when you're working with a buyer. I recommend that you put as much in here as possible because this really outlines for your buyer all of the work that you're actually going to be doing for them. If we don't put a lot of information in here, it appears that we're not really doing a whole lot for our client. And that's not the reality. So be as detailed as possible in this section. The next point, point number 6, really talks about your client's responsibility to the agent. And so we covered this a bit in the Consumer Relationship Guide, in that it's our client's responsibility to keep us updated on any changes in what's happening in their personal life. So whether that's related to financing or a job or relationship status, anything that could impact the transaction, the client's responsible for letting us know changes in their situation. That way we can all be on the same page and we know where we're at in the process. Point number 6.2, and some of these items, when you're filling them out, some agents might have different dates than others. It really depends on how you want to set up your business. The way that I filled out this form here is what I typically would put in the form. So point number 6, during this agreement and 90 days after the agreement, the buyer must give us copies of any offers that they enter into. And so the reason that is there is it's really to protect us as agents, and that if our client was to go out and do things on their own and enter into a transaction that maybe we had introduced them to that property, they truly do still owe us the commission amount that we have outlined. So it's their responsibility to be really above board and ethical in keeping us updated on anything that they might be doing as far as writing offers on other properties. Point number 7, it's just explaining to our client that it's not a conflict of interest for a designated agent to show you a property owned by a seller that they also represent. So if our buyer is looking for a property and we have a seller who has a property that matches that criteria, and our client says, hey, I want to see that property, it is not a conflict of interest for us to show them that property. And a conflict of interest occurs when the designated agent acts as a sole agent for both you and the seller. And in those cases, they must tell the buyer that there's a conflict of interest. We talked about this when we went over the Consumer Relationship Guide conflict of interest portion. So just familiarize yourself with that. Point number 8 talks about how we are paid as agents. And so what you're going to put here is what you would typically be charging for the services that you are offering. So for example, you may put that your fee is 3.5% on the first 100,000 and 1.5% on the balance. You can also put in here anything addressing maybe bonuses that might be offered by the seller. You can add that to that line. 8.2 is a business practice that I don't do, but many agents do charge their buyers a retainer in order to work with them. And so that retainer is really used to compensate the agent for any expenses that they may have in the transaction. And so, for example, maybe an agent would charge $1,000 as a retainer, and that would be used to cover things like gas and time for going to showings and writing offers and things like that. It's left blank here on this form because that's not something that I typically do. I do not charge a retainer. I am paid once a transaction is completed and is successful, and that's when I would receive payment. Okay. Now, the next sections, they're just talking to our buyers about if they have to pay for our services that are up here. In most situations, this 3.5 and 1.5 that you would be charging for services is something that the seller of the property typically offers the buying agent. And so for your buyer, they're really not out of pocket for any of our services because the commission amount does come from the seller. However, there are some situations where maybe the seller is not offering a commission. And so in that situation, we have to talk to our buyers about how that payment is going to be made. Let's just see here. Okay, and so 8.3, what this is saying is that if the client was to purchase a property within their search criteria and they did that on their own while they were under an agreement, we as their agent are still entitled to the commission because this agreement is still in place for the timeline to help them find a property. If they go out on their own and they write an offer anyway with someone else and get it accepted, they still do owe us the fee that they had agreed to in this form. If the client is responsible to cover the fee in part or in whole, I put here that they must pay it within 3 days of the completion of the transaction. Again, depending on who you are, you might put a different day in there. They do not have to pay us a fee if they buy a property that's excluded in writing from this agreement. or if they sign a buyer's representation agreement with another brokerage that begins after this agreement ends. So if our agreement ends and they decide that they're going to work with another agent, they no longer are obligated to pay us a fee. This point here, number 8.7, this would talk about if we were to receive a bonus from the seller, and we did not indicate up on line 8.1 that we were entitled to any bonuses that might be offered, we then would have to pay that extra bonus back to our buyer because that wasn't part of our agreement. Okay, so here I put NA because when I fill out my agreements, I usually indicate that I would be entitled to any commission or bonus commission that's offered by the seller. Okay, and 8.8 talks about what would happen if the buyer decides to end this agreement before it is over. Some people, again, will charge their buyers an expense for the time spent and for gas money and things like that. And for myself, I usually just put NA in this portion because, again, I don't charge a retainer and I don't charge people for my time until the transaction is actually completed and the commissions are owing from the seller. Okay, point number 9, personal and confidential information. This is just outlining that we have to keep information confidential. This was outlined in the consumer relationship guide that we covered earlier, so you might want to familiarize yourself with that. And the duty, we have a duty to continue that confidentiality after the agreement ends. That is indicated on point number 10. Point number 11 is just outlining for our buyers that in many situations now, there may be video recordings or audio recordings in people's homes. And so we just want to draw their attention to that and remind them that when we're in the home or we're pulling up to the home and we're at the front door and they have a doorbell camera, that we just really be cognizant about what it is that we're saying because somebody might be listening. So if you're going through the home and they absolutely love it and they're talking about, oh, you know, I can see my couch here and this is where I'm going to put this and there's excitement, you may want to just remind your client to keep some of that under wraps because you don't want to give the seller too much information if there is a recording going on. Point number 12 talks about indemnification. And so if anything goes wrong with the transaction and it's a result of our client not disclosing pertinent information to us, that we are not held responsible for their behavior. Point number 13 is just any additional term that you might have or an agreement that you've entered into with your buyer. So just an extra spot for us to give more information about any extras that might be going on in this transaction. Point number 14 talks about early end to the agreement. So we really, just because we have dates in there of when our agreement starts and when it ends, doesn't mean that that is written in stone. If we're dealing with a client and we find as we're working together that maybe our styles are different, maybe we don't click, both the buyer and we as agents have the ability to end this relationship. The only thing that you need to be aware of is that ending should be put in writing. And so if a buyer's decided that they no longer want to work with you, that they really be sending you an email to outline that. And at the same time, if we decide that it's not a fit for us, that we outline that we are ending that agreement. Buyer acknowledgement. This is just where the buyer acknowledges that they have read this agreement, that they have received and read the consumer relationship guide, and they acknowledge that this is creating a sole agency relationship with a designated agent, and that you have the opportunity to get independent advice from a lawyer before signing this agreement, if they choose to have that, and that the agreement actually sets out what we have agreed to. The final page really is just where we put the buyer's contact information, so name, address, phone number, email, both sides, and then the brokerage, which is Remax Complete Realty, and their address here, and your name as the agent would go here with your phone number and your email address. We would indicate the date that this is signed. The buyer is going to sign here. Second buyer would sign here. And we as agents are going to sign here. Then when we give them a copy of this, we put the client has to initial here indicating that they have a copy of this agreement, and when that was provided to them is indicated here. And that concludes our course on the exclusive buyer's representation agreement.